Morning. My voice is a little rough this morning. We will make it through just fine. I just got back from West Virginia. We were holding a meeting there. It was one of the old school meetings. We were Sunday through Friday, and between more preaching and the change in weather, it got my voice a little bit. Came in this morning, and Josh Smith was asking my kids, how did you enjoy the trip? And Cozy said, we saw a fight. And children are awful. And so in case you too have heard, we saw a fight, I need to give you a little bit of clarification. It was not at the meeting. It was not amongst Christians. We went into Pittsburgh. So we went into Pittsburgh for the day, and we were at waiting in line for a fairly famous restaurant there that was kind of known for Pittsburgh food. And a guy decided he didn't want to wait in line, and instead he jumped the line, and the next thing I know, the owner of the establishment is dragging him out in a headlock and saying, I don't want any of your business. And everything you've ever heard about Pittsburgh isn't entirely true. The thing that blew my mind was the fact that they come out, and there are, first of all, it starts out with two guys, and then there's a third guy who just appears from nowhere, and he's like 4 times the size of a mountain. And it was amazing. He just took the other two guys and just dragged them like rag dolls. But they are knocking furniture over. My kids later on said, I've never seen grown men upset before. And I said, yeah, that's why grown men should not throw temper tantrums. But out of nowhere, in the midst of this, because it's getting bad, it's getting to the point where I'm concerned that somebody will escalate it another level beyond physical altercation and start bringing out weapons. And out of nowhere, about 9 police officers show up. And I don't know where they came from. They just kind of like appeared out of the ground. I think that's just how it is in Pittsburgh. We just know you'll need to be here. So just show up. But in that moment when they showed up, all of a sudden everything just changed, because you go, okay, authority has arrived. We're in the midst of talking about hope. And one of the aspects of hope that we don't think about is hope is built off of the idea that there is some final authority. Is that there's somebody who will show up and fix this whole thing in the end. In Job 6, Job will say, would that God were willing to crush me, that he would loose his hand and cut me off. You think about that language. Would that God were willing to crush me, that he would loose his hand and cut me off. Job is at the end of hope. But then he says, it is still my consolation, and I rejoice in unsparing pain, that I have not denied the words of the Holy One. When you consider Job and all that he went through, his final end result to it is, I wish I were dead, but since I'm not, I find comfort in this one thing. I have not denied the words of the Holy One. When there is no rest, how do you endure? Because that's what the ultimate goal of our hope in Christ should be, is that I have no guarantee of rest here. That was the whole point of Job. God has this conversation with Satan, and Satan says, look, if you'll just take the hedge away from him, if you'll take any hope of goodness in this life away from him, Job will renounce you. If Job doesn't have a hope that it'll turn out okay here on this earth, things will be better tomorrow, all the platitudes and the Hallmark cards that we use, what if he really genuinely has no hope in this life that it will ever get better? Won't he deny you then? Job 6 is your answer. It is still my consolation, and I rejoice in unsparing pain, that I have not denied the words of the Holy One. As we look this morning, we're going to be in Romans 8, and we're going to begin at the end, and we're going to then go back to the beginning. Romans 8, verse 25 says, "But if we hope for what we do not see, with perseverance we wait eagerly for it." That's the punchline. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to read the punchline first, and then we're going to go back in the text and say what led to that punchline. The punchline is that, look, with perseverance we wait, and it's not just waiting, we wait eagerly. We can eagerly wait and persevere if we have hope. Hope is what perseverance gets its strength from. Perseverance is the application of hope. If you really want to know how much you hope in God, ask yourself, how good am I at persevering? That is the definition of it. Because in Romans 8:25, he says, look, if we hope for what we do not see, meaning I have a hope in a God I can't see, I have a hope in an eternity that I can't see, I hope that even if this life everything is horrible, I know that when I die, I'll meet God and every tear will be wiped away. If I have an unseen hope, I can eagerly persevere. The depth of your maturity as a Christian oftentimes can be measured by your ability to persevere, because Christianity is not a weekend hobby. It is meant to be something that you do every day of every week through an entire lifetime, and you are faithful until death. It requires perseverance. And it is not best seen, your perseverance is not best seen on the good days. It is best seen on the bad days, when the wheels fall off the wagon, when you just went to lunch and a fight broke out, when you just had plans that life would be happy and easy and restful, and you had expectations of good things, but instead you got bad things. We're going to work expecting it to be a good, easy day, and then you're met with one problem after another, and the day probably would have been okay, except you'd expected it to be good. One of the problems that we can have as Christians is that if our expectation is that life here will be good, all of a sudden we're not very good at persevering, because we put our hope in not what we can't see, but what we can. We're looking for something tangible to hope in. God, make my life better right now and right here. What happens when that goes away? What happens when you get the diagnosis that takes that away? What happens when you have the job loss that takes that away? What happens when you face something in your life that you did not expect, and it throws a curveball, and you have to figure out who you are? That's what Romans 8 verse 25 is saying, is that if you really want to know the depth of your faith, look at your ability to persevere. Our goal this morning is to get better at that. Because ultimately, Christians should be hopeful people. We have a lot to be hopeful for, but we have been tempted by the tantalizing ways of this world that says, don't project your hope out to that great, far, and distant anchor of salvation. Instead, find your hope in the things you can see, the baubles and the shiny things of today. We want to get back to what matters. So now that we have the punchline, perseverance is the application of hope. If you're a hopeful person, we've got to be persevering people. Let's now go back to Romans 8, verse 18. Romans chapter 8, down in verse 18, it says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us." One of the things that Paul says in Romans is that when you begin to make some comparisons in your mind, between the sufferings of this present age and the glory that is to be revealed, that will build hope within you. Hope is built through consideration and comparison. There is a Darius Rucker song that simply starts with the phrase, "It won't be long." And every time it comes on the radio, I will have kids go, "Oh no, this is the one that makes Dad cry." And the reason that they say that is because it's about a father and his daughter, and she, in the very beginning, it starts out with her as a baby, and she won't go to sleep until he's up, and it's late nights, and there's coffee, and not enough coffee to make up for the lack of sleep. And don't worry, it won't be like this for long. And then he goes to kindergarten with her, and he tries to drop her off, and she's clinging to his leg, and she's crying, and it's hard. And don't worry, it won't be like this for long. And then he goes to pick her up from kindergarten, and she doesn't want to see him anymore. And don't worry, it won't be like this for long. And it goes that way all the way through to the point where he walks her down the aisle. And the whole point of that is, if you're raising children and you think about the hard times and you compare them to the shortness of time you have with your kids, everything becomes clear. You begin to, it gives you perspective. I want you to imagine in your mind's eye a line that runs across the front of this pulpit and runs out that wall, just fires right out the side of the wall. And then it continues right down Bardstown Road. And then it continues further and further and further, an infinite distance. Can you imagine it? And then I want you to think of that line as representing the timeline of your life. And I want you to realize you're right here. You're just right here on the front edge of the pulpit. Compare what is ahead to what you are facing now, and the glory that is to be revealed is so far greater. Glory, is one way to define it, is honor gained through notable achievement. When you're parenting, the notable achievement is them reaching adulthood alive and as taxpayers. And that's a notable achievement. Anybody who has raised their children to know God, to be faithful, and to be contributing assets of society, you know that that is a blessing. Marriage. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 28, Paul literally says to anybody who would consider being married, I'm going to tell you just what the text says. I'm not going to come up with it. It's not Scott Beyer's opinion. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 28, he says, anybody who gets married, such will have trouble in this life. It's literally what God says. If you seek to get married, such will have trouble in this life. Marriage comes with lots and lots of trouble. But when you compare that to the joys and the blessings that can come with being married to a godly spouse who loves the Lord more than they love you, and the help and benefit that comes from building a life together, yes, the trouble is worth it. We need to make comparisons and considerations in our life so that we understand our purpose. Because one of the things that we forget is hope is a purpose-driven thing. You don't have hope with no purpose. Hope is always driven by meaning, by purpose. There's a book by a man named Viktor Frankl. And in that book, he details his life in the Jewish concentration camps during the Holocaust. And he survived it. He was a doctor, and as he went through it, he tried to take, one way that he coped with the pain of being in those concentration camps was by seeing it through the eyes of a doctor. And he said, one of the things that I began to notice was there were people who were taken off to the gas chambers, and some of them were some of the best of us. But others died just through the horrific nature of the environment and the lack of food and things like that. And he said one of the ways that we began to see that somebody was near death was they began to trade out their food for cigarettes. Because people would do that. You had food, which was not much. I mean, we're talking about a corner of bread. But when a person got to the point where they said, I would rather have a cigarette, which was a small amount of momentary pleasure in a horrible environment, if they'd rather have that than food, you knew they'd given up hope. Because they're no longer trying to live for tomorrow. They're just going to take what they can and run. Do you know what our society wants you to do? It wants you to take what you can and run. It wants you to take the cigarette. But what does God tell us His Word is? Man does not live on bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. You need nourishment if you have purpose. If you don't have purpose, then you just take your fun and run. People who do not have hope do not survive. Romans 8:19. I apologize, by the way. I think these are a little bit harder to read, so just hang in there with me. But just so you know, you can open up your own Bible. Romans 8, verse 18 through 25 are the only verses that we're going to be looking at. Romans 8, verse 19, it says, "For the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God." One of the things that we find about hope is that hope longs for the rest of the story to be revealed. I want you to fall in love with God's story and with your story, because those two stories are intertwined. The story of Jesus Christ is intertwined with your story. One of the things that we see in Jesus' life is Jesus walked on this earth and His life became intertwined with other people's lives. You can't talk about Jesus without also talking about His apostles. You can't talk about Jesus without also talking about Mary Magdalene. You can't talk about Jesus without also talking about the lives that He touched and the disciples that followed Him. And then, when Jesus got to the end of His life, He's resurrected from the dead, He spends 40 days down here on earth, and then He goes up to the Mount of Olives, and He ascends into heaven. And two angels say, "Why are you staring up there? In like manner, in the same way in which He left, He'll come back. He'll return someday." Jesus' story isn't over. There is a return journey that happens. And when that return journey happens, it will not just be Jesus' story that will be revealed at that point. It will be your story too. Right now, you probably have friends, family, and coworkers who do not understand why you would be doing this every week. And they don't understand your religious tendencies, and they might even accuse you of being legalistic or pharisaical, or just roll their eyes at you being far too passionate about this religion thing. Right now, your story doesn't make any sense to them. It will. It will. It will when Jesus is revealed. Because it says it waits eagerly for the revealing, not just of the Son of God, but of the sons of God. What we're waiting for is the end of the game. When the buzzer sounds and the final score is tallied, and somehow, man, it sure seemed like those Christians were way behind on the score count, but they sure racked up a lot of points in the final seconds. We're waiting for the revelation of who we really are. Because who you are is not who the world labels you as. In fact, I would argue that who you are isn't even who you label yourself as. Most of us struggle in some way or form with defining ourselves by every failing and fault. That who we are is a list of weaknesses and shortcomings. And part of why you do that is because you're trying to be a better person, and I encourage you to do that. Keep doing that. Examine yourself daily. Do this thing where we work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. I'm not telling you not to do that, but I'm saying that when God looks at you, He has a different view of you. Now, your job is to get up every morning and live faithfully for your Savior, Jesus Christ. Your job is to get up every morning and try and be a disciple of the one who died for you. But that does not mean that you have a proper view of yourself in the eternal scheme of things. And I'll tell you what, especially on my down days, the days where I feel like the worst version of myself, I eagerly long for the revealing of the sons of God so that I'll know who I actually am in the sight of God, which is the only thing that matters. Who cares what you think of yourself? Who cares what your fellow man thinks of you? The only thing that matters is what God thinks. In Romans 8, verse 20 through 21, it says, "For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of Him who subjected it in hope, that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom and the glory of the children of God." One of the things that we find is that God has a plan. It says God subjected the creation, and He did it even though He subjected it to futility, that is, to vanity. And nobody likes that. But God did it in hope. One of the things that hope requires is for us to have an architect behind our life. To feel like there is some meaning behind what I'm going through. If you go back to the book of Job, Job chapter 6, we look at the redeeming character of Job where he says, look, this is my constant consolation that I've not denied the Holy One. But Job is full of Job's pain as well. And in Job chapter 9, when Job is dealing with his friends who are not very good counselors, they're not very good for his self-esteem, and they're not good for bringing him comfort. Job, in chapter 9, down in verse 30, makes a statement. He says, "If I should wash myself with snow and cleanse my hands with lye, yet you," this is God, he says, "yet you, God, would plunge me into the pit, and my own clothes would abhor me. For He's not a man as I am, that I may answer Him, that we may go to court together. There's no umpire between us, who may lay his hand upon us both. Let Him remove His rod from me, and let not dread of Him terrify me." Job, in his darkest moments, the thing that you will see him struggle with as you read through the book of Job is a belief that maybe, just maybe, God doesn't care. Maybe, just maybe, God's just toying with him, and that is a terrifying, dreadful fate. He says, look, I could be the best person I am, but there's no umpire between me and God. And Job's right. There is no umpire between you and God. There is nobody who can trump God and say, well, you know what, God, you made the wrong call on this one. Job's darkest moment, he says, look, nobody can correct God for me, and I think God's made a wrong decision in my case, and I'm not sure that He cares about me. Now, at the end of the book of Job, Job realizes that's not true. He understands that God is an architect and a designer who has made everything, and He watches over everything, and He does cause all things to work together for good for those who love Him, who are called according to His purpose. But in his dark moments, he forgets there's an architect, and you're going to be the exact same way. In the moments that test your hope the most, you will find that you forget there's an architect. And what I'm telling you today is remember there's a plan. Do you get to know all the details of that plan? No. That doesn't mean there isn't a plan. Do you get to be involved in all of the details? Do you always get a say-so in the plan so that the plan turns out the way you want? No. But that doesn't mean there isn't a plan. And if you are taking a journey and you count every steep valley as we're going the wrong direction, you won't finish the journey. What Job needed to do is to remember, no, God knows what he's doing. And I need to stop listening to my buddies who have given me no comfort. Romans chapter 8 reminds us that yes, we are subjected to futility. Sometimes life feels futile, vain, meaningless. Solomon wrote an entire book about that subject. But it's subjected to futility. What's the next thing? He subjected it in hope. There is an overarching plan by our Creator. And what you are going through and what you will face, it will be okay. In Romans 8, verse 22 through 23, it says, "For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. And not only this, but also we ourselves having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our body." Over and over and over again, God in his description of promises, whether it be the promise of eternity with God, or it be the promise of Jesus initially coming to the planet, and Old Testament, and God saying, no, I'm sending my Messiah, he'll come. He will often refer to it and use the figurative language of comparing waiting for something to childbirth. Because childbirth is a process that involves, and we have a word for it, labor. We call it labor. I'm so thankful I'm a man. I'm just going to say that out loud. I'm going to speak of that of which I do not understand. But there is a pangs of childbirth in the process of bringing a child into this world. And Jesus himself says, look, when a woman goes through the pangs of childbirth, she labors in pain, but then when the child is born, what does she do? She forgets the pain. She forgets the pain for the joy of that which has arrived. Right now, you are in a groaning process. This life is hard, and you are in a groaning process that is a reminder that you are not fully born yet. You will not be fully and completely realized as to who you are until Jesus comes back. And so right now, you don't quite fit in. And right now, it is, you live in a world where you are a misfit. And that is part of the process. But Revelation chapter 2, verse 11, one of the things that Jesus says in Revelation 2, verse 11, because remember, in Revelation, it's not just John writing, but there are things that Jesus has to say to the churches. And in Revelation 2:11, he says, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death. He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death, because there is no second death. Because if you are a Christian, there is no second death. Everybody faces the first death. Everybody dies once. But you know that, remember that dumb saying that was around for a while, YOLO? You only live once. I preached a sermon once, and I said it shouldn't be YOLO for us, it should be YOLT, which arguably is not the most eloquent sermon I ever wrote. YOLT doesn't exactly have a ring off of the tongue, but it is, you only live twice if you're a Christian. You don't only live once. You live twice. And this is the first and most unenjoyable of those two lives. The best it is here is worse than the worst it will be in heaven. Your best day here is worse than their worst day in heaven. You're groaning now. That comes with the territory. Romans 8, verse 24, he says, "For in hope we have been saved, but hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he already sees?" Now, we're almost back to the punchline. The punchline is perseverance. If you have hope, show me your hope through your perseverance. That's the punchline. This is the line before the punchline. What kind of hope? In hope we have been saved, but hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he already sees? In Hebrews 11, verse 27, in describing Moses, it says, "By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen." He endured as seeing him who is unseen. It's a fascinating thing to think about Moses, who saw him who is unseen. Because Moses wanted to see God, didn't he? He said, "God, could I see your face? Please show me your face and it'll be enough for me." And what was God's answer? "No, you cannot see my face." But he lived as if he had already seen it. What we're looking for is a character trait as Christians where we have the hope to see the unseen. You will find that Christians who are deeply persevering are also very imaginative. And I don't mean imaginative in that I make a fake world up. I mean imaginative in the sense of they can conjure up in their mind, when they need it, images of what the Scriptures speak of eternity. They can take the passages that God has given us to anchor ourselves to the hope that is far off, and they can envision those things happening. And because they can see the unseen, they can put one foot in front of the other. I want you as a Christian to be more imaginative. In this sense, it's the difference between watching a television show and reading a book. When you watch a TV show, you don't need to be imaginative. SpongeBob is right there in front of you. Right? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but studies have been done, and it is a fact. You watch SpongeBob, your IQ will drop. That is a fact. That is not up for debate. That is a fact. Some of you are now currently thinking, how smart could I possibly have been? Television gives you somebody else's imagination. They give it to you, just watch. It's very passive. When you read a book, you are required to conjure within your mind's eye an image of those things that you cannot see. And some of you are amazing readers. And what I've found is that when you find somebody who is a very avid reader, they will often get to the point where they get to the end of a book and they're kind of sad. They're sad because they had to bury their friends. Right? They had all this series of books and they got to know these people and they got to go on adventures with them, and now I just bury you and I have to go about my life. And they're sad to see the end of a book. It's because they're very good at seeing the unseen. I want you to work on that. Because when you read the Bible, what God has done is He's told you what will happen. And I want you to put yourself in the middle of that story. And I want you to realize that someday that final page will be turned. And Jesus will return with the shout of an archangel. And all the dead in Christ shall rise first. And on that day, do you see yourself there? Do you see yourself there? Because hope sees the unseen. We haven't had that day yet. But I wish so desperately for you to see yourself amongst those ranks on that day. And if you do, then what you will find is that you will learn to persevere. Because perseverance is the application of hope. And now we're right back to the punchline that we began with. If you aren't yet a Christian, then this story's not your story yet, though. And that needs to change. You cannot have hope in the architect of salvation if you've not placed your faith in the architect of salvation. I want this book to not just be the book, but I want it to become your book. And so if you have not yet obeyed the gospel, here's what we mean when we say stuff like that, obey the gospel. Obeyed the good news. Gospel means good news. God has some good news that his story came down to earth. Jesus came down to earth so that his story could become your story too. And if you're ready to be baptized into Jesus, that's how that happens. Your sins will be washed away. You will now be a part of the body of Christ, added to the number and rank of people that belong to him. And every verse that talks about Jesus returning with his people to gather his own will now be a verse that speaks about you as well as other people. If you're not yet a Christian, that's not your story, but I so desperately want for it to be one. I want it to be your story. And everybody else here does too. If we can help you to obey the gospel, please come forward as we stand and sing.